Mind lock.
Locking in 3, 2, 1.
Okay, welcome to another episode of Locked In with Dylan. As always, I'm your host, Dylan Nadler, and today I'm joined by podiatrist and human movement specialist, Dr. Emily Splichal, who also is the founder of Naboso. So, I guess, before we even get started, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on the show.
Of course, of course. I'm glad to have you. I think this is different than so far the route that we've taken, having, coaches and athletes. I think this is good within the realm of sports, but it attacks a different issue that I think a lot of people will get value from. So, I'm super excited to have you on. I mean, before we even get into the whole Naboso thing, why don't you just take me through like, what got you to this point, how you started getting into the industry, what you were like, and kind of just like letting it flow from there.
Absolutely. So I'm a podiatrist by trade, human movement specialist. That's kind of the clinical hat, but I've been in the fitness industry for over 20 years. And before that, I was a competitive gymnast. So I love movement. I love sports. I love body weight training, fascial tension, all of that. So essentially my entire childhood into early 20s with gymnastics led the way into fitness. And then when I was in fitness, that's when I started podiatry school, went to graduate school. And I knew that I always wanted to blend my medical side with this movement side because of my background and my appreciation. So it really, I think, was just the timing of the way the industry was shifting. The barefoot running boom was as I was finishing medical school. So I took a really special interest in that and then developed my education company called EBFA Global in 2012 as a way for me to share this perspective or background in fitness, movement, barefoot podiatry. And now, 10 years later, I have a barefoot education company. I've written several books about barefoot education. I obviously developed Naboso. So my approach with the body movement performance longevity is tapping into the nervous system from the ground up. So through the feet and the power that our feet holds from a sensory side.
Interesting. Do you find that, would you say without your gymnastics career, do you think that you still would have had the interest to pursue this route of going through that education side and through podiatry and really like appreciating the feet and the sensory motor stuff? Or is this something that you always were into, like a big science person? Or do you really think that the sport aspect was the gateway that led you to being interested in this?
That's a really good question. I have always been kind of science nerd. I love the human body, but definitely my background in gymnastics led to that appreciation for me to even think about personal training. So I became a personal trainer when I was 21, and I just adapted really quickly to the use of your body, right? Like what it feels like to push your body and train to a certain level. That was instilled from me being very, very young. So I do think that it was pivotal. Other characteristics of the gymnastics is also the focus, the driven, the discipline, and all of that goes into characteristics that are career building also. So yeah, I'm so glad that my parents put me into gymnastics.
Yeah, I feel like anybody that decides to go into business and do something like that, it's so important to have that context, right? Like you said, being on the front lines, so to say, and having that athletic background. I think whether you're an agent or you're a coach, you're an athlete, or you decide to go into any sort of field related to sport, I think without that context of being there firsthand yourself at some point, at any level, it doesn't have to be the highest level, it adds value. And I think there's so many people out there that pursue these types of industries that have never actually set foot on an athletic stage themselves. And to me personally, I just feel like there's a big disconnect there, because if you want to connect to your audience, I mean, you have to relate to them in some sort of way. And how else? There's no other better way to relate to your athletes and the people you're trying to get the product out to, if you haven't been there yourself, right? So do you find that, like you said, building the discipline and just the attitudes that come along with being an athlete, as well as having the context behind, okay, what do athletes actually use as opposed to what's just marketed to them? You feel like that really helps guide your kind of thinking in terms of what helps all the athletes that you try to work with.
Yeah, yeah, and I teach a lot at athletic training, NSCA, Perform Better. So these large strength and conditioning conferences. And I'm up there speaking with primarily male dominated. It's a male dominated industry. And I'm speaking to coaches and trainers who are working with, professional football, soccer, MLB, sports that I haven't played, right? Maybe more male dominated sports, but because I have my athletic background, I can relate to what they're athletes, exactly like you said. And then I try to bring the kind of the intellectual side and understanding the demands of the body. But there's always this undertone of, I was a competitive athlete. I understand the mental, physical side of training athletes and performance and injury risk because of, how the mental side pulls into what these athletes are going through physically every day. So yeah, I am glad that I have that, and I still train today. So I try to still carry that that characteristic. So I'm still in the trenches of what it means to like use the body. You have to kind of walk the walk yourself versus just being in this periphery of that disconnect.
Yeah, no, that's huge. I completely agree. Did you always see yourself as becoming an entrepreneur and a business owner? Or did you kind of think for at least at some point in your career, you would just go into private practice and kind of do it the way that everybody else does traditionally? Did you ever feel like you were on the fence about that, or did you always know like, okay, I'm gonna develop my own thing?
So I grew up around entrepreneurs. So I think that entrepreneurship and the freedom of your controlling your schedule, controlling your life is really important. And when I became a personal trainer, it's kind of like being an entrepreneur, right? Even if you work for a commercial gym, everything, your success is directly related to your time on the floor or how you're hustling to get those clients in again. So there's this element of entrepreneurship in fitness just from the get-go. And then I really did choose medicine because even if I was a sole practitioner doctor, it's being an entrepreneur, right? So I could control and dictate how I wanted to see patients. What I don't think I anticipated was that as soon as I finished residency and I launched my education company, I started getting invited around the world and teaching. So just immediately from, off the bat of having my license, I was all around the world. I'd spend a month in Asia, and then I'd come back for a couple of weeks to the US, and then I'd spend a couple weeks in Australia, and then I'd come back, then I'd go to Europe. And I literally, for 5 years, would not be in this country for half of the year. And that really shaped a lot of how my career is now. So the 10 years of what it looks like after being licensed and started my education company was because of, maybe I got the travel bug, the entrepreneur plus the travel bug, but there was just this freedom of having control over your life and what it could look like. And the ability to question things is really what it was also. So reading research, questioning it, putting it into programs, writing programs, delivering that program and doing it in my own way, that then led to me being known as, barefoot science from the ground up, foot sensory fascia. So I have a really unique approach that is my own brand identity, and now I'm known for that. And it was because of, I guess, that entrepreneurial side from the beginning.
Yeah, and I really like where you're coming from there, and I think you touched on a good point that we also said just a while ago of, I think being an athlete really kind of sets you up foundationally for a lot of those skills that you need to be an entrepreneur. I think there's a lot of crossover there, and I think it's in a way it's like the same process because as an athlete, if you're not working hard and you're not grinding and you're not in the gym, I mean the results aren't going to come. Right. And being a business owner and entrepreneur is the exact same thing. Like the input to output is completely controlled within you. And I think there's a lot of skills that you develop through being an athlete that you learn. Okay, you know what? It's not that scary. I have the ability to take this into the palm of my hands and do something with it. Right. I think not coming from that background, the risk feels a little bit more scary because you're like, whoa, I'm about to go off on my own. There's no safety net. What happens if I fail? And I think as an athlete, we work through a lot of those problems in sport. And then when you want to transition into business and other things, you've kind of been there before and you're like, okay, you know what? I've done this before in another way. It's not that bad. And I think, touching on what we said before about the ties between, athletics and moving on to other things, that's a major one too, of like the foundational skills. So now, talk to me about Naboso. So how did the concept to turn your experience and your knowledge, how was the process of turning that into a product that you decided to sell?
Yeah, so as I had said, I would travel the world teaching my education. So I had an education company. It was content, it was um, kind of this programming. And I remember speaking to other companies, CEOs of product companies that had education to sell the product. TRX would be an example, right? Trigger Point, Rock Tape. A lot of brands that people are familiar with have their product, and then they have the education to drive the product sales. And I remember one of my mentors, who's a CEO of one of the companies, saying, "You need a product. Like what next do you give these people, right? How else, just from a business perspective?" And it used to kind of bother me because I was like, well, my education should be enough, right? I'm helping them. But from a business perspective, I could see someone being like, you have to have a product. It's a different animal, it's different revenue, right? So you're looking at the scalability of the business and also the impact. So I didn't want to force it because I didn't know what it was. And then I was approached, and I was kind of playing around with a little bit of ideas of surface science, that barefoot is awesome. Everything I teach about is activate the feet, get your shoes off, get into the feet, stimulate the nerves. But then I started questioning and saying, well, once the athlete or the individual takes their shoes off, they bought in the whole barefoot training thing. But then what, right? What surface do they train on? How can we get even more out of the feet after they have agreed to take their shoes off? So I started researching different surfaces. Is there a way to activate the feet even more? And then I started running across textured insole research, so textured research. And there's dozens and dozens of research studies around texture and foot stimulation, but no commercially available product. So then as I was doing that, I was approached by an engineer that had heard me say before that I have a few ideas for products and stuff like that. So it was just kind of the timing. So then I just dove into it, didn't know what the product would end up being. But 2 years later, after that, it was a textured mat. And that was the first product that I developed. And now, 3 years later, we have 4 different mats with different levels of stimulation, 4 different insoles. We have a release ball. We have a couple new products that are in development now, and it's a full product line, textured, 2-point discrimination to stimulate the hands and the feet to optimize movement, performance, balance, longevity, and it has completely taken off in a way that I never thought it would. But now I see, thinking back to what that CEO told me, is that product does have much higher impact potential because it's not just the exercise I might teach or the theory to be barefoot, but it's actually something that allows the athlete or the layperson or the patient to actually achieve what I've been speaking about.
Yeah. It sounds like you've had, over the course of your career, a lot of specific knowledge about this stuff, right? Between, starting out in the front lines as an athlete and then really doing your research, going through school, developing an education program, traveling the world to, tell people about this, very like a lot of underlying knowledge there. Did you ever feel like when you transferred over to the business side, not really transferred, but when you created a product, because you said you didn't know too much about it, right? And now you have to deal with maybe hurdles that you haven't seen before, right? Whether it's manufacturing, whether it's marketing, sales. Did you have a moment where you're like, man, I'm so used to being so good and so knowledgeable, and now I'm in this realm where I don't know what I'm doing. Did you ever feel like that? And if so, like, how did you work through it?
Oh my God, absolutely. Absolutely. They do not teach business in medical school, and I do
Hmm.
not have an MBA. So it's very different to market an education company, which I grew, right? It's in 40 countries, but completely different trying to market physical goods, completely different animal. And the involvement from a team perspective of, import, export, factories, vessels, patents, the whole gamut. So I surrounded myself by a team of mentors which is always recommended. We have a board of advisors. I actually have gone through 2 different business accelerators. So I call them like little mini MBA programs where I learn a lot about the legality and the marketing and the team and the operations and logistics and all of that. But I do remember I was pitching to a investment group, and this was maybe two years ago, 3 years ago. It was early in the beginning side. And the person, the head investor, was like, "You're not a CEO, you're just a doctor." And I like started crying, like not in front of them, but I was just like, no, like I'm trying, I'm doing the best I can without having gone through business school. And yes, I am a doctor, and I've spoken in public for years, so I can deliver. But what it looked like and the analytical side from a business perspective, I had to learn. And each year I become more and more knowledgeable. But that's because, maybe going back to the athlete thing, is your mind is set on something, and the discipline, the self-discipline and the self-motivation for me to read books and to listen to lectures and to search for these accelerators so I could train myself, that was all self-induced, right? And then as an athlete, you lose games, so you have to have thicker skin. Me kind of like falling off the balance beam is not going to stop me from still training. So here, I just consider them like a little fall off the balance beam and then got to get back up, just because I believe in it so much.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting about the whole you're not a CEO, you're a doctor. I mean, I think a lot of people struggle with that whole identity piece when, you really grow up believing that you're something and, maybe you lose that. So as an athlete, you could be doing a whole, sport your whole life and, you might be known as John the hockey player, right? For example, and when you stop and you retire, people are like, well, what am I now, right? If I'm not John the hockey player, who am I, right? And that's why there's a lot of identity issues. And I think one thing to remember, for athletes like that and for just people, not even athletes, is to remember like, okay, you can take that foundation like we're talking about kind of this whole time and you can put that into something else, right? Just because you're not the athlete doesn't mean that you've just given up on all of the skills that you've developed throughout this course, whether it's physical, whether it's mental, emotional, interpersonal. All of these things are going to lead to something else, but it's a matter of, having almost just like the optimism to see that happen, right? Because that's kind of my take on it, is you need to see it happen. And for you, like you were talking about, it would have been easier to kind of go back into your shell and say, well, maybe I am just a doctor, right? Maybe I should be the person that tells other people how to run their businesses and I can kind of provide the science behind it and I can run the research, but maybe I'm not equipped to be that person that calls themselves to call themselves a CEO. But at the end of the day, it's about trusting yourself and being like, you know what, I was able to become so successful in one field, right? So for someone, it might be an athlete. For you, it might be, in education. And to say, you know what, why can't I do that in something else now, right? Why can't I take those same practices and that same strategy and the same skills that I used to become so proficient in one thing? Just because I'm new at something else doesn't mean that I'm going to be bad forever. It just means that I have to start, and it's not even from scratch. I heard someone else saying, it's just starting from experience, right? Because you're not starting from scratch, you're starting from experience because now you've done it somewhere else in another field and you just have to replicate it. So I think, what you talked about, I think a lot of people are going to be going through that soon. I think there's going to be a lot of athletes that are retiring now because, there isn't a lot of opportunities for them to compete. And there's going to be a lot of people that are wondering, like, what's my next step, right? If I can't be Dylan the athlete, who am I? Right. And someone might say, well, you're just an athlete. You're not a business person. You can't go into medicine. You can't, you're not an academic. So I think where you're coming from, and maybe you can just offer like a quick, maybe like a motivational thing of, what would you say to that person who maybe on the tail end of a career of, maybe athletics, and they're looking to transition into something new, but they're like, man, I don't want to be bad at something. Right. What would you kind of say to that person where you're like, you know what, it's not that big of a deal and you have time?
So I don't know if you know Mike Fitch. He's the founder of Animal Flow, and he has this great quote that he always gives, that he says, get good at being bad, which I think is great. And when we're adults, it's a little uncomfortable to be new at something or to be bad at something, right? Especially maybe around our peers, or if you're just always used to being, the straight A student or the athlete who wins every game or wins every race or whatnot, right? There's something very empowering of being being bad. You learn a lot about yourself, and you have to disconnect from the ego that is really fed by this identity of, I'm the elite athlete, or I win every game, XYZ. And then the more that you do it, you actually find that it feeds a different part of yourself, your ego, right? You kind of feel stronger or less scared. The fear of failing kind of gets pushed away because there's no expectations to it. You're just kind of in this experience. Outside of business is that I told you I was a gymnast, but it was kind of the peak of me doing my education company. I was traveling a ton. I was not seeing my friends in the US because I was always out of the country, and I kind of felt like I was missing part of myself and needed something just for me. So I started doing aerials, so kind of like Cirque du Soleil, and
Right.
I had the foundation. So I really like how you said you build off of your foundation of other skills, right? I had foundational strength of my body, but it was a language that I knew nothing. And I'm going in there with people who are so talented, and it was very, very humbling, but I had to go in with this perspective of being bad, right?
Right.
And being fine with being bad, right? But then it completely changed my life. And doing aerials literally completely changed my life because it's very fear inducing. You have to face your fears. You're 15 feet in the air wrapped in fabric, right? And you have to do drops and then learning new skills and finding strength. And I defined my body in a completely different way, which is very similar to the fear of trying to manufacture a product and come up with something is partly a financial fear because there's a lot of investment in it. And then is someone going to like it? And then the fear of, I have to be kind of like, it's almost like being naked in public. When I put my product out there, I'm literally exposing it for people to judge. And people could hate it. They want to return it. They think it's stupid. I get hate mail from podiatrists who think that this is the dumbest thing ever. Like, you literally have to put yourself out there. And the more you do it, you become stronger at doing it. And what leads me is the belief that I am helping people and that it is actually valid based on science and there's an impact to be made. So for those that are listening, I think impact associated companies or products or missions or purposes fuel you in a way that it pushes you past that ego side that is scared at being bad or failing at something.
Yeah, I like that. And I like the fact of trusting yourself. And if you believe in your product, that's, really the bottom line. I think, like you said about other podiatrists sending you hate mail, like I think in traditional industries, I think like, especially the one that you're in and even the one that I'm in with, kind of like psychology based, there's a lot of kind of old school people that don't like innovation. Not that they don't like it, but it's like less accepting of it, right? And if you're not doing it by the book, the cookie cutter way, it's, now it's bad. It's a bad thing, right? And I think sometimes it's just about having trust in yourself. And if you feel like, what, screw what everybody else is saying. Like, I know that this is something that works. I really believe in this. I use it all the time. I would recommend anybody to do it. Like, that has to be the bottom line, because if you leave yourself vulnerable to what everybody else is saying, I mean, you're never going to go anywhere, right? And I think that's a big aspect of it. So tell me about, because for me, I've never been a person that wore insoles, right? I've never really like thought about that. And even doing sports on my feet, like, I did Taekwondo for 15 years, which is all on your feet, all kicking, all moving around. And, I never thought about insoles and doing stuff like that. I wore slippers everywhere I went, like everywhere. Tell me about, what do you say to the athlete or to the person that goes, well, I feel fine, right? I'm sure this is something that's easier to sell to maybe people that are recovering through something or they're in rehab. What do you say to the person that's listening that they're like, okay, this is cool, right? I understand maybe the concept of insoles and the concept of like foot health, but I'm not really in pain. Like, I feel comfortable. My day-to-day life is fine. Why spend $50, $60, $70 on something for my feet when I'm not really feeling it? So maybe if you want to start with like the science behind the sensory stimulation and then go into the more general, however you want to attack the question. But I think this is important for the average listener that feels like, okay, cool idea, but I don't know if this is something that I need because it's not something that bothers me.
Yeah. So first off, everybody stresses their feet every day, all day. So when you're on your feet, whether you're running, standing, walking, whatever it is that you're doing, you are stressing and requiring physical sensory demands from your feet. It's our body's foundation. So a little bit of a tension or a reset or a stimulus or a strengthening to your foot influences the rest of the body in ways that we may not appreciate until we start to tap into that access point, from core stabilization to glute strength to force to power to offset fatigue. It is literally everything. And a lot of people look at feet as a biomechanical structure. They just think, oh, how much movement? Do I have an arch? Do I not? Do my toes move? So it's kind of very mechanical. But there's this very powerful sensory side to our feet that is actually more influential than the mechanics. And that's the sensory side. That is the skin in the bottom of our feet that has very special nerves. And those nerves blend into the fascia of our feet, which blends into the fascia of our entire system. And I look at the bottom of the feet and our fascial web as an extension of our brain. So just your whole fascial web, to put a little kind of like cool fact to it, has over 100 million sensory nerves, which to me is fascinating. So I look at our connective tissue and skin of the palm and the bottom of the feet as this second brain, and it's sensory seeking. It wants information to control and dictate the coordination of our movement and the timing of that coordination. So everyone benefits from that. Athletes, hands down, because athletic performance is all timing. If you can't stabilize fast enough, subconsciously, you will not be at the peak performance. Or that athlete next to you, or the person who, from like a taekwondo or a martial art perspective, right? They're just going to be a millisecond faster. So when we look at the skin in the bottom of the feet, there's special nerves that are sensitive to different stimuli, and texture is one of that. And that's where all this research that I was going through led into me understanding this. I'm just going to show the texture on the Naboso insole so people can see it, right? So it's kind of these pyramids that are across it. And when you think texture, I actually want the listeners to think 2-point discrimination, which they might be like, I don't know what that is. Braille. So braille dots, the pattern of the braille, we are stimulating the exact same nerve in the feet as braille when you read it with your hand. So same nerve, and it's differentiating the 2 points. That helps to create this environment to the feet, to the brain, and it paints a picture. So the more texture or 2-point discrimination, think of it as braille for your feet if you want, that you bring in, you activate this acuity and awareness to your environment. And that's what we need, right? Where is our foot? What's the timing of the foot? How am I interacting with the ground? And then that influences everything up. So from a kind of the benefits of this, if you have no pain or no medical condition with your feet, it is still foot strength, offset foot fatigue, foot recovery, timing of stabilization, performance, balance, acuity, awareness, so all of these things. So we use them with a lot of athletes in both they'll wear them from a training perspective. So maybe when they're in the training house or the field house doing lifts and things like that, to recovery. So when you're off of the field or the court or whatever your sport might be. Or some people actually use them. We have a lot of baseball pitchers that will use them in their pitching shoes. So they're actually, throwing a pitch. They feel their foot placement just a little bit faster, and that translates to shoulder stability, and then obviously the way that they throw. So many different ways that it could be applied, from our insoles, mats, and then our other tools, to really, again, we're training the brain. So I consider it a neurotraining.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. And for me, so you guys sent me a pair, which I'm super happy about. I so when I train, I train with bare feet on mats, right? I'm kicking, punching, wrestling, all that stuff. So I'm not using it when I'm training, but what I do is I like to go on walks a lot, right? I'll go for I'll walk for like 10 kilometers sometimes. I'll put in a podcast. For me, to go with the decompress, I get outside, like, especially, I don't know how it is in Arizona, but here we're still like completely locked down, like pretty bad. So we can't really even do anything. So I've been going out on a lot of walks. And for me, I put those in my shoes, and I feel like you're talking about the awareness piece, right? Like when I put my feet in, I feel it right away. And it just brings an awareness to like being present, right? Because I think for me, and I don't know how everybody else does their walks, but I'm always focused on everything else, whether I'm listening to a podcast or I'm, talking to family on the phone or I'm, DMing a client, on Instagram, whatever the case is. I'm doing a lot of other things. And the physical movement is almost like on the back burner, right? It's like that's why sometimes you can go for a walk and you're already there before you even know it because you've been thinking about other stuff. And I feel like that happens to me a lot. But wearing these insoles, it brings the awareness to the forefront, at least for me, where I'm like, okay, I'm walking first, right? I'm walking first. I can feel the steps. I'm aware of how my body feels in my feet and how it's stimulating that. And then I'm doing everything else on top of that. But at least from my perspective, it brought a lot of awareness to the actual movement when I'm just walking and moving in other shoes. I mean, that's like the farthest thing from my mind. Like I don't have to think about one step and then another step. It's just nobody does that. But with the insoles, because of the texture of it, and I haven't worn insoles before, so I don't know if it's the same thing with like the soft squishy ones. I don't think it would be. But with the texture part, I'm like, okay. And I actually get excited now, like when I see them because they're cool. Like they're like you showed, they're nice and blue and they're bright. They're different than like my regular Air Force One Nike sneakers. Put them in, and it's just like cool to look at. I'm like pretty excited now. Like if I'm looking between my shoes, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna put those ones in because they're cool. Like it looks at me, I'm like, okay, the cool blue ones. Let me slip those in, and right away, I'm like, wow. I put my foot in, and it just like I said, it brings the awareness to the front of my attention instead of I think so many times when we're moving and doing stuff, it's just at the back of our mind. Like we're not even thinking about how we move. Is that like the response that you typically get?
100%. And I could not have said that better. So thank you for that. That was actually really well worded. And we get users, whether it's an athlete, consumer, patient, professional, that's kind of putting it in their own words. So I love to hear how people explain it. The consciousness or the forefront, right? Kind of the presence, and you're walking first versus doing all these other things is exactly why we also recommend them. So a lot of people actually tune out their feet. So it's kind of tuning
Yeah.
in, tuning out is how you reference the nervous system to movement. And we tune out our feet because we have all this other noise going on, right? Noise is kind of other stimuli, and you tune things out, right? We don't hear the traffic anymore because we tune it out. Because a lot of people tune out their feet, they are not aware of how hard they're striking the ground. Maybe then inaccuracy, they're bringing in higher impact forces than they should, ankle sprains, and just kind of this what's happening with the foot. They're just completely sensory disconnected from the foot, where this will go back to my appreciation as a gymnast is so foot focused because it's a barefoot sport and everything is about the precision of your landing. So I think feet and barefoot and foot awareness was drilled into me very early on, and I didn't even connect it until obviously now. But by being present and conscious of our foot placement, we then build more optimal movement patterns off of that. And a majority of movement, especially for athletes, when you are sprinting or running or you're opposing someone or you're in a fight, it's subconscious. You're not thinking about the timing of the core and the stabilization and the exhale. It has to all be reflexive. What drives subconscious patterns when you are in the moment thinking of something else is sensory stimulation. So we are building conscious patterns that will then lay the foundation for when you switch and you go subconscious. And that's why we use it a lot in recovery. But that's really why everyone can benefit from it, because everyone subconsciously moves every day, right? Walking is subconscious. So we try to be that present reminder, like the little person on the shoulder saying, stabilize your feet, strike the ground properly, things like that.
Yeah, and I think, self-awareness and consciousness, there's a domino effect to it, right? And like you said, with your feet, because it's an extension of the brain, with the neurons and like all of those sensory motor skills, when you're self-aware and you're conscious even of your feet, it kind of has this like bottom-up effect where now it translates to everything else, right? So now because I'm aware of my feet, I'm aware of my breathing. And because I'm aware of my breathing, I'm aware of my thoughts. And because I'm aware of my thoughts, I'm aware of my attitude. And it really is this domino effect that trickles down. And when you kind of tune things out, like you were saying before, I mean, it's easy for that to fall that way too, because when you tune one thing out, it's easy to tune something else out. And now you have, a situation where, I mean, you can tune everything out, and that's just not a good environment to be in. So I think not only is it bringing attention to and bringing the awareness to your feet, but that does have an effect on every level, and it really does work as like a bottom up process. And I think like that's huge too. So it's not just the feet, but like you said, because you're bringing awareness to just some part of your body, is going to kind of switch on your brain to go, okay, let me be present and not put all these things on the back burner. So you obviously don't have just the insoles, but you're saying there's a lot of other products on this product line, right? Like balls you can roll your feet on and mats. I think recovery, and this is something that I touch on a lot with my athletes that I work with. Recovery for a lot of athletes is like just so not a thing to think about, right? Because it's like, I've worked so hard, I put the hours in the gym, I want to go home and rest, right? Like, I've put the work in. Like, people don't even stretch a lot of the time, right? They do their work in, they go home, and they like just chill because they're like, okay, I deserved it. And to recover, whether that means using a foam roller or stretching or using some sort of product that's part of your product line, for a lot of athletes, it's like, feels like a chore, right? You're like, I already did the training. I don't know if I want to extend that training into my house because here's where I need to relax. How do you talk to those people? And can you kind of explain how the importance of recovery and leads into better training for the next day, right? So if you're training multiple times a week, why it's so important to keep that going when you get home because of the benefits it leads to when you go back to the gym.
Yeah, 100%. So my approach, the physician hat, is that you really do want to think of it as this stress recovery balance. So kind of like two scales, right? And they're balancing each other out, or like a seesaw or something like that. That you training, you're on the court, on the field, fighting, whatever it is, that stress starts to uptick obviously every session or day, and you want to balance it with what you're doing on this recovery side. So it's this fine art of balancing stress and recovery. Now when you are, as you're saying, like you're tired, you just want to like veg, sit on the couch, versus doing kind of this whole system of recovery, you then start to tip the scale. Well, this would be the stress. You tip the scale more in the direction of the stress, and we all eventually hit this physiological threshold where you will get injured, right? It'll be an itis, it'll be kind of a tweak, you feel the nerve, is whatever it is. And especially for certain sports that have asymmetrical dominance, then that can be very damaging to the potential career of the individual, because it's also this threshold that you just don't want to get past this point of no return. It's very hard to catch up, to play catch up, or to react to a injury or a compensation versus everything on this side. So I try to tell patients and athletes and trainers and et cetera, when I work with them, is think small doses every day leads to this higher accumulative effect than, okay, twice a week I'll do 30 minutes focused recovery routine. What can you do in smaller doses that is actually achievable, and that maybe you could kind of layer in with other things that you're doing? So I'll take the feet, for example, because it's a little bit easier. Is I tell people to release their feet when they're brushing their teeth, right? So if you're going to brush your teeth hopefully 2 times a day anyway, that if you have something like our neural ball split in the domes in front of your bathroom sink, you know to release your feet when you're brushing your teeth. So you at least get hopefully 5 minutes twice a day of that release. And there's also certain parts of the body that have high return. So you get a higher ROI from them by doing a release versus some other ones. Let's say the feet, because a lot of fascial lines blend into the feet, a lot of people will actually feel pressure decrease in the lower back, like their glutes will kind of let go, the IT band might relax because of how all of those fascial lines insert into the bottom of the foot. So I see it as a kind of a multitask release with a high return because of all the tissue that runs into it. But then for other ones is, could you couple it in a way that you have a higher compliance, similar to your walks and you're listening to podcasts? Can you find that as a time where you do maybe listen to a podcast that you really like, so you have this other positive benefit from it, but you're doing the myofascial work at the same time? Or can you find tools that work a little bit better for the body, such as maybe like a rad rod versus a foam roller, if like getting down on the ground is a little bit kind of like, oh, I'm exhausted. At least you could roll with a rod or a stick while you're watching TV or sitting there listening to your podcast. So I try to make it realistic. I'm also a huge fan of recovery modalities that are not actual body work. So like whole body cryo and infrared saunas and red light therapy. And, those are easy to kind of piggyback on other things. So I like to do infrared sauna, and then I do my myofascial work when I'm doing the infrared sauna and I'm listening to a podcast. So I'm trying to do it all at the same time so that you can get this high return with what you're doing and keep it small doses every day, have a higher return.
Yeah. It's about being efficient with your time, right? Bundling as many things as you can. And I think for me, one of the biggest things that I try to explain to my athletes is the importance of not just goal setting, but micro goals, right? So what can you do every day, right? And you touched on it too about has to be realistic, has to be achievable, right? And one of the things that a lot of athletes can do every day is prioritize recovery, right? Because that's something realistic. Listen, it's unrealistic to say go run 10 miles every morning, right? I mean, would it be cool? Sure. But is it sustainable? It's not sustainable. So when it comes to setting a micro goal for an athlete, things like stretching, things like managing diet, things like water intake, things like recovery and using these products, these are things that you can do every single day. It's not hard, but it's going to contribute 10%, 15%, 20%, who knows, to you being the best version of yourself. So this is something that I would recommend to all of my athletes is, listen, if you're looking for something to do every single day and you just kind of ran out of ideas, right? Because you might not have a big bathtub where you can do ice baths, and you don't have, you don't live in like a warmer state where you can just go for jogs. Something like this is huge because, like you said, even just 5 minutes while you're brushing your teeth to kind of roll your foot on top, that's something that's going to set you up to be even 1% better than you were 10 minutes ago, right? And the more of those types of tools you can implement into your daily routine, I mean, the better you're going to be, right? So this is something that everybody should use and take advantage of. Talk about like what's next. I mean, you have a huge product line, and if you want to kind of talk about your funding thing, because I mean that's major too.
Yeah.
Go into that. I mean, I'll kind of intro it. Not only if you're listening to this, do you feel like, man, I need to get my hands on some of these Naboso products, but you can get your hands on some Naboso equity too if you're really vibing with it. So kind of plug both of those.
Yeah, so we're doing a crowd equity raise, and a crowd equity raise means that we are allowing, or it's the government opens up for consumers, resellers, patients, individuals, people that would otherwise not qualify to invest in companies. You have to be kind of a formal angel or have a certain equity or annual income to actually be a qualified investor. So this essentially opens that up to the world, to anyone. And the investments start at $150, and we are selling equities. We're taking 10% of our equity to raise $1 million. And the purpose of that $1 million is to obviously fast track our growth because we're on a very rapid trajectory, but it's also to then do certain aspects that further validate the efficacy of our products. So doing research is really important for us. We have a couple research studies that are underway, but we want other industry-based ones, athletic-based ones, certain athletic injuries, really demonstrating the force and showing the science behind the product is really important. And then, you got to market it. So it's really to accelerate our growth. We have another 4 or 5 weeks left in our raise. People can go to startengine.com. That's the platform that you invest through. And like I said, investments start at $150, and then they obviously go all the way up, and you get some great perks. So you get the Neural Ball if you invest $500, and you get our Duo, which is a double-sided silicone insole, when you invest $250. So that's how the investments scale. And then other things that are in our pipeline is we have a new product that's coming out that I really can't disclose too much about it, but if people like the Neural Ball, which is a release tool, so it's a ball that splits into a dome and has our texture on it. It's made of silicone. It's kind of in this space, but a little bit more advanced, let's say. Hand and foot stimulation is really where we are at. And then I know it's not directly related to our conversation, but we also have a couple of pediatric, so children's products that are coming out, because sensory is so important for children, and the quality and how they integrate sensory really lays the foundation to their entire future development, both mentally, emotionally, and physically. So we want to have a few products that favor and kind of market to children. And so these parents understand how the children need that as well. And we also have apparel that's coming out soon. So that's always fun.
That's cool. So, I mean, listen, like if for everybody listening, there's tons of ways to get in on this, right? Whether it's by getting one of these products, whether it's by investing in the company, even through me, you can use my code that I got. You could use the code locked in for 10% off everything at the Naboso website. So please feel free and go ahead and do that. And I mean, listen, it's at least to me, it sounds like it's a company that is doing good work, for the right people, right? It's people that need it. It's whether you're, like you said, it's a child going through early stages of, sensory motor development. It's an athlete, maybe it's an elderly person that needs to really bring awareness back to the body. And also even from the business side, the way that you're speaking is, you've come from a place of a lot of resiliency, right? Especially being a woman in business, especially a traditional business, dealing with a lot of kind of pressures from outside sources and getting through that. I mean, mixed with your athletic background, I mean, there's a lot to want to support here. And I think when it comes to supporting businesses, a lot of the times it comes to supporting who it's run by, right? And if you like that person, you believe in that person, I mean, the rest kind of falls in place. And I think, you're that person, especially for a lot of people. So, there's tons of ways to get in on this, whether it's going to the site and getting something that's going to benefit you. And like, Dr. Emily was saying, the ROI on that is huge, right? What's the ROI on, faster twitch muscles? What's the ROI on recovery? I mean, it's almost infinite depending on, how you perform in your sport and what the perks are. I mean, to spend a little bit of money on a product that's going to make you any sort of percent better is always worth it. And then also backing the company if you want, where this is something that, is really going to change the way that a lot of people perceive recovery, and a lot of people perceive sensory stimulation, where I mean, there's nothing like that. Like you said, there's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of recovery-based things, but not much with the sensory side and with the texture. And I think that was the first thing that caught my attention when I put those on, is there is a big difference between texture and non-texture. Because, I mean, the base insoles in all of our shoes are flat, right? They're all flat. They could be cushy. They could be firm. Like, that's not really the variable that we're talking about here. We're talking about the texture side. And for me, like I said, brought awareness to my feet, which domino effects brings awareness to every single part, which is just like what everybody's looking for. Everybody wants to say, well, how can I be more self-aware? This is definitely a way to do that, right? Start being introspective. So, I mean, thank you so much for coming on. I think this was huge and just a big element that a lot of people need to start thinking about. And I think it's great to hear from you. Where can people find you if they want to know more, right? If they want to say, okay, I really like Naboso and Dr. Emily, where can I see more of this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. So our website is naboso.com, so naboso.com, and we are all around the world. So our site geolocates to wherever your listeners may be, and we ship from various fulfillment centers around the world as well. We're on all the Amazons, so Europe, UK, Canada, US, we're on those Amazons. For me personally, my Instagram is dremilydpm, and I do a lot of education and informational posts. So I try to help people better understand the foot and the body through my platforms, including Instagram, and then Naboso is on Instagram as well, which is NABOSO_technology.
Cool. Well, you heard it here first, guys. Sensory stimulation with Dr. Emily. I mean, like I said, this is huge. This is a good bonus. And I think anybody listening, if you're looking for a way to take the next step and even just do something small that's going to help you benefit over the next little bit or the whole course of your career, this is definitely a good next step to take. So thank you so much for coming on. And I wish you guys all the success in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much.